Well, thanks for the invite. It's good to be talking. My first talk, I think, at Royal Holloway, which is disappointing. My daughter was a student there 10 years ago. My first invitation. So, yes, it's nice to be back, if you see what I mean. So, David has talked to you about this, about drug science. So, I don't need to go on any more about how wonderful this particular organization is. So, just make sure that if you want to learn anything about drugs, you just go on that website, and it's all there for you. Follow us. But actually, talking about drugs, that's quite a dangerous topic. And this is an image of me being sacked, government's chief drugs advisor, for telling the truth about drugs, for saying that cannabis and LSD were less harmful than alcohol and cigarettes. And it's quite an interesting event in my life. It's led me to set up drug science, alternative to the CMD, and it's spawned quite a lot of developments. One of which was President Obama. Am I sounding all right?
Yeah, you're coming through good.
Not breaking up, okay? Because I can turn my video off if you want.
No, it's coming up. It's coming up good. I'm just going to mute myself now.
All right, okay. So here's Obama saying that cannabis is less harmful than alcohol. And the reason he said that was because at that point in time, which was nearly 8 years ago, wasn't it? About 50 million Americans, maybe more, had access to medical marijuana, but it was illegal then, as it is now under the federal law. So the feds were breaking up pharmacies, and Obama said, "This is stupid. We don't want a civil war against cannabis. The states have said it's medicine. Let them have it, because at the very least, it's not as harmful as alcohol." So that was a major statement, and actually, it was the first time an American president had told the truth about drugs. And that changed the whole temper of international policy in Western society, because up to that point, the Americans had dictated our policies. But if they couldn't dictate their own internal policy, they didn't have they couldn't really take on the responsibility of ours. So it gave the Western world a chance to change. Now, what I'm going to argue that the current policies in Britain, which are extremely flawed, are flawed for 6 reasons. And our prohibitionist policies have many problems. There's 6 here. And the first I'm going to talk about is they're biased. They're biased regarding the drugs that are controlled, and therefore they're dishonest and they're immoral, in fact. Now, the first thing to say is that there is no definition in the UN conventions or the UK Misuse of Drugs Act of what a drug is. And so it's left to politicians, newspapers, and the drinks industry to make that decision. So here's what I think is a very clever advert. Say no to drugs. That way you'll have more time to drink. And it's amazing how the drinks industry has managed to get people to believe that alcohol is not a drug. It's a drink. It's a food. It's a refreshing liquid, but it's not a drug. But of course it's a drug. And this policy they've pursued with great vigor since the repeal of alcohol prohibition in the 1930s. So given that there was no definition of a drug, I came up with my own, and that's this. A drug is something a politician once used but now regrets. And here are a couple of examples from my period in advising government. Jackie Smith, the first female Home Secretary, was asked a question when she became Home Secretary. "Jackie, have you ever taken drugs?" And she said, "I smoked cannabis, but I didn't enjoy," which is a kind of bizarre thing. Why did she bother to smoke it? And I guess that was because you had to do that to get into the Labour Party in Oxford at the time. Now, when she was at Oxford, there was another guy called David Cameron there, and actually you had to do stronger drugs than cannabis to get into the Conservative Party. They still began with the letter C, and his nickname was Cocaine Cannabis. And he said, "I did things when young I shouldn't have. We all did," and by which he means the Tory front bench. People like Michael Gove as well, he's still famously noted now for his cocaine parties. So these people have all used drugs, but they still pursue policies which would criminalize less fortunate people than them if they get caught. If we care about the harms of drugs, well, one harm we might care about is the likelihood of dying. And these are drug-related deaths in the UK, with tobacco at 80,000, alcohol at about 28,000. Opiates rising year on year, probably over 3,000 now, but way below the 2 legal drugs, tobacco and alcohol. And drugs like ecstasy and cannabis, very low down. And when we did a very systematic assessment of drug harms, when I set up the drug science charity, those 12, 13 years ago, it turned out that if you look at all the harms of drugs, the 16 different harms of drugs, that alcohol is the most harmful drug in the UK because of the size of the red bar. And the red bar is the harm that alcohol does to society. And because alcohol is so widely used, it's the most harmful drug. It's not the most harmful drug to the person. To the right, you see heroin, crack cocaine, and crystal meth. They're more harmful to the user, but there's not so much harm. And crystal meth is a particularly interesting example because there's very little social harm because very relatively few people use it. Now, on the other end, you have drugs like magic mushrooms, LSD, ecstasy that are much, much less harmful than alcohol, both to the user and to society. And that tells us something really important. There is no correlation whatsoever between the UK Misuse of Drugs Act or the UN conventions and the harms of drugs. No correlation whatsoever, 0.04. And that tells us something also very important, that the current UN conventions and the UK drug laws are not evidence-based. And therefore they're immoral. They're probably illegal as well, but challenging them in the courts is something we've considered, but we've always been told we would lose because the government essentially makes the law and it doesn't have to tell you on what grounds it makes the decisions. So the reality is our current UK drug policy has largely been driven by American policy, and American policy was driven by a combination of the repeal of the Prohibition of Alcohol Act, which led to the demonization of cannabis as an alternative way of employing the DEA, and the Nixon 1968 campaign. And this man was the brains behind this campaign. Nixon was losing. He was pro the war in Vietnam, and the people of America weren't. And so he came up with this amazing ploy. He said, we have two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Fantastic campaign. It deflected people from the Vietnam War to the war on these nasty people in the States that were using drugs. Nixon won every state except Maine. But as Ehrlichman said afterwards, did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. And that's exactly the same as the UK government and the Blair-Brown government started to crack down on cannabis users in the 2000s because they wanted to show that they were tough on drugs and they wanted to get the right-wing vote. And in fact, the reality is the war on drugs is a war on people. But not all people, just the people who use drugs, and often the people that are disadvantaged, poor, and many of whom don't vote. And the problem with lying about drugs and drug harms is summarized by these two great quotes here. Charles Darwin, false facts are very injurious to science, for they endure long. And Mark Twain, slightly more psychologically aware, how easy it is to make people believe a lie, and how hard it is to undo that. And the lies about the harms of drugs are still present in all our drug policies today. So let's spend a little time focusing on cannabis, which was really the drug that got me sacked. You can see here in the spliff, there's me with my moustache, and here are all the other scientists on the committee that resigned when I was sacked. And this is the man who sacked me, Alan Johnson. And what was the argument for keeping cannabis prohibition as it was? Well, there was certainly no evidence that prohibition was useful. Here's the data on the number of users of cannabis following the banning of cannabis as a medicine in 1971. And this was done on the behest of America with a view that it would actually reduce recreational use. And you can see it had no such effect whatsoever. Over the next 40 years, recreational use increased. The number of users went up 20 times. The amount used must have gone up 100 times. And it's flattened out at about this level now. So prohibition of medical cannabis didn't stop recreational use. It just stopped in its tracks research into medical cannabis. So why did we do this? Well, it was because, I told you already, because the Americans demanded it. We hadn't banned it in the 1930s when they banned it as a medicine. But how could the government justify a policy to keeping medical cannabis away from patients? And they came up with three arguments: skunk, the stronger version, driving, and schizophrenia. And in fact, none of these are significant compared with alcohol. But that was what they clung on to keep cannabis illegal. And they've kept it illegal recreationally still today, as you know. So the second major flaw in the current punishment-based approach is it puts punishment above harm reduction, which is a moral choice. And yet there are masses of evidence showing that harm reduction has huge health and economic benefits. So it's not just the moral choice, it's actually a perverse moral choice. One of the most amazing statistics is how the prison population in Britain has more than doubled since 1994. And that increase is all down to people who use drugs. Almost all of them are drug offences. So we've doubled our prison size just because we treat drug users as criminals. The third point is that punishments are disproportionate to harms. And in fact, worse than that, they do more harm than good. Because it's absolutely unassailable that punishment leads to deprivation, economic deprivation, social deprivation. And social deprivation is the perfect soil in which you breed drug dealing. So we created this monster of the underground drug dealer by punishing people who use drugs. And this policy is a peculiarly racist policy where we've got 3- to 4-fold overrepresentation of Black and Asian young men, despite the same level of cannabis use as young white men. And the creation of an underclass is a serious problem because an underclass, as I said, has very little option. If you get a criminal record for possessing cannabis, you can't go into the police, the civil service, into teaching. It's very hard even to go into the army. So if you're basically facing unemployment, well, drug dealing is an extremely lucrative and somewhat sensible thing to do. The fourth aspect of current policy is one that's particularly exercised me in recent years, and that it severely limits treatment and research. So this is collateral damage that actually is rarely spoken about. But since I've started working in the field of psychedelics, I've realized how utterly destructive to this research the control of these drugs under Schedule 1 of the Misuse of Drugs Act and one of the UN conventions has been. But it's not just research, it's also therapy, treatment. In many countries in the world, over half of the world's population, that's China, India, Indonesia, and Malaya, are not allowed access to opioids for pain control. Because the governments decide it's easier not to have the drugs at all than to hold them under the controls and the secure housing that the UN conventions require. So they just say, oh, sorry, we won't give it to our population. In most countries, only 20 countries or so in the world have got legal cannabis for medicine. And in the UK, we've had it for 3 years, but there's only 3 prescriptions on the NHS because doctors refuse to prescribe it and pharmacists refuse to allow doctors to prescribe it. There's nowhere in the world where psychedelics are actually a medicine. MDMA is banned in most of the world. And because they're in the UN Schedule 1, their research is largely blocked. And yet they have enormous potential. We have potential for cannabis for pain, sleep, spasticity, cancer, PTSD, ecstasy for PTSD and Parkinson's disease, psilocybin for depression, OCD, cluster headaches, LSD for terminal illnesses, addiction, and mephedrone, which was an interesting short-acting stimulant that came along in the 2008s, was being developed to treat addiction and depression. But research on these is all banned because it's almost impossible to research with these compounds because of their Schedule 1 status, which requires licenses to possess, to dispense, to receive, etc. This graphic shows it very, very harshly. So you see on the left-hand side from 1950 to 1967, rising numbers of publications for LSD in blue and magic mushroom juice, psilocybin in red, until the UN blocks it in 67. The Americans ban it in 67. The UN bans it in 71, and there's a precipitate fall. And there are 2 reasons for that horrific fall. The first is after the Red Arrow, the US government which had funded most of the research up to the Red Arrow, ceased to fund it. It's never funded another LSD study since. And also, if you could get money from charities or philanthropists to study these drugs, it was almost impossible to get hold of them. And there was actually, I think, an unwritten desire by the UN and the FDA to eliminate all knowledge of these drugs. They wanted to get all research to disappear so no one could say, oh, you did a bad thing by getting rid of them. They wanted people never to know the truth. But you can see in the end here, we are fighting back. And also the same was true for cannabis. Now, the moratorium, effective moratorium on cannabis use only lasted about 25 years. The one on psychedelics has lasted 55 years. But both had a totally destructive effect on research. And I think this is the worst censorship of research in the history of anything. Certainly, you've got to go back a long way to come up with any comparable example. In fact, you've got to go back to 1616. And then the papacy, the Congregation of the Index, banned all books written by this man, Nicholas Copernicus. As you know, he was the man who worked out that the sun rather than the earth was the center of the universe. And that conflicted with Catholic teachings. And they banned his books for 140 years. They executed Giordano Bruno for teaching his writings. And they gave Galileo the choice to recant or die, and he decided to recant. But that ban, though it was long-lasting, only affected Catholic countries. So Northern European astronomers could actually look at the skies and read the books of Copernicus with impunity. And truth is, there weren't that many researchers. Astronomy was a relatively small profession, whereas in the 50 years that psychedelics have been banned, hundreds of thousands of doctors and hundreds of thousands of neuroscientists have been denied access to these remarkable tools. If you want to read more about it, a couple of papers I've written. This one in Nature Reviews Neuroscience is a very big one, covers both psychedelics, ketamine and MDMA and cannabis. This one is a little more focused on psychedelics. The fifth major flaw in our policy is it encourages the use of more toxic compounds. And history tells us that this is inevitable. You go back to the early 1900s with the Opium Act, trying to stop Chinese people smoking opium in London using the pretext that they were corrupting young women particularly. What happened? People stopped smoking opium. Easy to stop people smoking opium because you can smell it and see it. They started injecting heroin and morphine. Alcohol prohibition in America led to the rise of hooch and methanol. And when you say to any politicians who believe in prohibition, you say, well, why do you believe in prohibiting drugs like cannabis? What do you think about American prohibition of alcohol? Oh, no, that was a really bad thing, led to the rise of crime. Why do you think it doesn't do the same with cannabis? Oh, let's talk about something else, shall we? Because they know that they have double think. They want alcohol, they like alcohol, they don't like cannabis. The ban of cannabis has led to synthetics such as spice. I'll talk about those in a minute. Mephedrone. When people stopped using mephedrone, they switched back to cocaine and amphetamines. MDMA led to the rise of much more toxic substances such as PMA. LSD bans led to the manufacture of drugs to circumvent the bans, such as M-bombs, which are more dangerous. And heroin led to synthetics, and now fentanyl, which is an extraordinarily dangerous set of drugs. So bans tend to lead people to make more powerful drugs because you get more profit from those. So let's look at cannabis prohibition. Now, traditional cannabis, until the 1980s, was a mixture of THC, 4 to 5 to 6%, and cannabidiol, between about 4 and 10%. And cannabidiol has a kind of protective effect. So basically, getting stoned on this combination is generally a relaxed, amusing, and interesting experience. But because we were determined to eliminate cannabis, and we started being quite successful in blocking importation, gangs started growing their own in the UK, and they started doing it hydroponically under UV light, and that changed the whole nature of the plant. It increased the production of THC, it reduced the production of CBD, and it produced skunk. And so skunk is 12+% THC, and it produces a much, much more powerful impact. You get stoned more seriously, and you get more dependent and you're more likely to get psychotic. So we've created this monster of skunk by trying to eliminate herbal cannabis. And then we carried on trying this prohibitionist policy. We tried to eliminate cannabis in our prisons by testing prisoners for cannabis. And cannabis hangs around in the body and in the urine for weeks and weeks. And prisoners were losing their third of their sentence parole by testing positive for cannabis. So what did the prisoners do? Well, the first thing they did was switch to heroin. There was a spate of heroin use in prisons. Then they switched to gabapentin. Then a few years later, people worked out that there were synthetic cannabinoids. And they were easy to smuggle in because they could be dissolved in water and had newspapers, we soaked into papers that were brought in, letters, cards from the kids, etc. And these substances are well more stronger than cannabis and much more unpleasant and much more dangerous. And there are hundreds of these different synthetic cannabinoids, and the attempts to ban them have actually just led to people making even more ones. So the first generation of synthetic cannabinoids had at least been tested in humans because they were developed as medicines, or they were so horrible they were never pursued as medicines. And the second generation had been tested in animals. And then the third generation are being tested in humans because no one's ever put them into any bioassay before. So our prisoners are experimenting on themselves. And we never had a death in prisons from cannabis, and we had 60 or plus deaths from spice in prisons last year. And of course, they've also hit the street. And now you see a very different profile. It used to be a time when if you saw someone curled up in a doorway of a shop, they usually had a half a bottle of vodka or whiskey with them. Now they don't. Now they just have nothing you can see because they've been stoned on spice. And it's corrupting our prisons. In some of the open prisons, up to 75% of them are using spice because it's not detected by current urine screens. And it's also corrupting prison officers. Up to 5% of prison officers are now drug mules bringing the spice into prisons. And all because we hated the idea that prisoners might spend some time having a relaxing escape from the 23 hours a day they're locked up in their little cells. It's victimization plus. Here's a really interesting social example of how access to less harmful drugs save lives. This is a methadone story. So methadone is a synthetic cathinone which was widely used in Israel from about 2004 to 2006, and then got into Britain about 2008. And it was legal, and it was cheap, and a gram wouldn't kill you. And you can see what happened to the cocaine markets in pink and the amphetamine markets in blue. These are deaths from cocaine or amphetamine. You see the precipitate fall in deaths from cocaine and 50% fall in deaths from amphetamines. Why? Because methadone was safer and people switched. Drug users are rational. If you can get a legal alternative, even if it's not as good, it's better to not run the risk of going to prison. And also methadone was actually less harmful. So this is the largest fall in cocaine deaths we've ever seen, occasioned by a rational, sensible, legally available alternative. But it got banned. The 2010 election, Anand Johnson, the Manic Sack Me, banned this drug in order to appease the Sun, who were campaigning to get the drug banned. And what happened after the stockpiles got used up after about a year, and then people switched back to cocaine. Now, cocaine deaths have reached an all-time high. Year on year, they're reaching their all-time high. Amphetamine deaths reached an all-time high. So an experiment that could never have been done scientifically, but was done in the marketplace, showing this profound impact of a less harmful drug to reduce deaths from a more harmful drug. And then the sixth problem with our current policy is it wastes vast amounts of money. The war on drugs has cost over $1 trillion. It's claimed over 300,000 lives. It's destabilized many countries and has had negligible impact on youth. So it is truly one of the worst economic decisions that has ever been made by the international governments. And I'm raising a question with you now. Is it time to learn from medicine? Now, this is Hippocrates, and one of his famous axioms is this one: primum non nocere. First, do no harm. And it's a key principle of medical ethics. You should try not to harm your patients. I mean, a lot of doctors do, and in those days, more of them did. But it is a principle that we tried as doctors to abide by. But the reality is, we don't have the same principle applying to the law. And that's unethical, and that's immoral. And I think really we should be campaigning to have our laws evidence-based and not doing more harm than good. And here's an example of a country that changed its policies to do something very sensible. So in 2004, Portugal was experiencing a massive rise in HIV. It was facing economic collapse because so many people were being criminalized for drug use that it brought in decriminalization. And the timeline of the Portuguese experiment, we have data 2004 to 2018. And in that time, you can see over this timeline, UK deaths from opiates went up almost twice. But in Portugal, they fell to 2/3. So you can see in a very graphic way how our prohibitionist policies drive deaths, and decriminalization with treating addicts as human beings and giving them options of treatment and dissuasion reduce deaths. So this is not only a brilliant example of the health benefits of decriminalization, but also they've been able to close their prisons. They've been able to reduce the number of police. They've been able to make huge savings in terms of health because their AIDS rates have fallen. So the Portuguese decriminalization experiment has been a resounding success, but we choose to ignore it. There are other approaches. Before Portugal, there was the Netherlands, and the Dutch decided about 40 years ago now to allow what they call coffee shops to sell cannabis. And they also allowed head shops to sell some relatively weak psychostimulants. And they did that to separate particularly the cannabis market from the hard drug market. If you go and buy cannabis in Britain, two things will happen. The first is that 95% of what you buy now will be skunk. And the second is most of the dealers will offer you heroin or crack as well as cannabis. The Dutch knew that, so they separated the markets so that their young people could get cannabis of all sorts of different concentrations and different variants of both cultivars and also CBD, THC mixtures in a safe place. And it proved a brilliant example because they separated the markets. They virtually eliminated heroin use in their young people. And at the same time, they did not increase cannabis use. And that's because getting rid of the black market in cannabis gets rid of one of the main drivers to use. If people aren't selling it openly to young kids, then kids aren't going to use. They have to make an effort, and there's age-related scrutiny as well. So we've got good examples which we could follow if we chose to. And this just repeats what I've said about the remarkable success of the Portuguese policy. I want to finish, though, by talking about something different that drug science has done, which was to try to work out, using this multi-criteria decision approach we'd used previously on drug harms, to work out if we could estimate the best policies for drugs. And this was funded by the Norwegian government. Norway, richest country in the world, has the second highest death rates from drugs in the world, which seems very anomalous. And that's because they have policies which are completely prescriptive and they don't treat heroin addicts. And so they funded us to ask the question, can we work out better policies? Can we estimate what's the best policy for drugs? So the first thing we had to do was we had to come up with all the different impacts of different policies. And there were 27 evaluation criteria that ranging from health, you can read them all here, health, social, political, public, crime, economic, and costs. So this is what's called the value tree. For all these different variables we have to think about, there's a different outcomes that relate to different policies. So that took a whole weekend. That was a conference in itself, just working out what those were and then defining them. And then we came back subsequently and we repeated the analysis, but on 2 drugs, well, on 3 drugs. So I'm going to show you 2, alcohol and on cannabis. And it's very difficult. With 27 variables, we realized we couldn't look at many different kinds of policies. So we broke them down into 4, what you might call classic policies. Absolute prohibition, and these are the definitions of absolute prohibition. Decriminalization, state control, and a completely free market. And you can see how we defined production, distribution, purchase, etc., in these different columns. So we scored those 27 outcomes on these 4 different policies. And here are the results. So the bigger the bar, the better the outcomes. And you can see that for cannabis, state control came out very markedly better than any other policy. And look how much better it is than what we have today, absolute prohibition. And why is that? That's driven because enormous improvement in the social impact is vast, because you don't criminalize 1 million young people, which you do under absolute prohibition. And the health impact is great because you don't have things like spice. It's better than the free market because it's much better for health. We've seen the free market of cannabis in places like Colorado, and it's led to more addiction and more harms from people taking very strong forms of cannabis. By the way, you'd be interested if we did the same for alcohol. And state control, like they have in Sweden, comes out clearly better for alcohol too. But interestingly, alcohol, absolute prohibition is not as bad for alcohol as it is for cannabis. It's still the worst option though. So we've argued now that state control of cannabis should be the way forward, like they've done, for instance, in countries like Uruguay. And in Washington state, they have a kind of sort of state control of cannabis to some extent. So my view is that we should have rational policies. We should have policies which are ethically correct and morally correct. And my view is that we should have a regulated market for any drug that is less harmful to the user than alcohol, because that's morally correct. It is completely wrong for a government to say that the only intoxicant you can legally use is one which is more harmful than an alternative that you're not allowed to use. And of course, by doing that, that would reduce the harms from alcohol, because people are rational. A lot of people would rather smoke cannabis than use alcohol, but they won't do it because of the risks of being caught, particularly if you're a young black man living in London. And it would also deflect users from more toxic compounds. If we made available MDMA, LSD, psilocybin, maybe even ketamine available in pharmacies, it would deflect people from methamphetamine, crystal meth, cocaine, crack, and heroin and other opiates. Why do I say that? Well, I've looked at some detail at the harms of alcohol. I wrote this paper a few years ago, A Tale of Two E's, one being ecstasy and one being ethanol, alcohol. And it was clear that on most measures, ecstasy is less harmful than alcohol. And I'll finish now because I wanted time for questions, but I'll just introduce you or remind you of something that probably David Badcock said. If you go to the Drug Science website, you can order any of these books of mine. They're half price to students. You can basically get that discount just by emailing info@Drug Science. Say you want to buy any book you like, get them at half price, and the small amount of proceeds, the profits that's left, will go and support the charity Drug Science. So I hope I've interested you and made you think, and I'm happy to take questions now. Thank you.